Um, there's many other resources. A friend sent me a link to this podcast of the author of a book, Steak, when the author Mark first had an Argentine steak and was shocked at how incredibly good it tasted. And it turns out the reason it tasted so good, it was incredibly nutrient dense from grass-fed, grass-finished steak from Argentina. And he wrote a whole book about it. Then he wrote a book about the Dorito effect. Corn chips don't taste good. So, because for various reasons, they don't have a lot of nutrients unless there's nixtamalization. So, the food industry has added flavorings to them to make them taste as if they're nutritious. But, if we eat stuff that tastes good because it's artificially enhanced, that's not healthy for us. So, he talks about trying to recover the lost wisdom in his third book, reducing cravings, and eating foods that are nutrient dense. Now, you can be vegan, vegetarian. John Mackey of Whole Foods Market, I think, is vegan still, arguing you could eat healthy plants, but you need the right combination of amino acids that are not available in the right way. In plants, you have to supplement some amount. But if you're careful, you can have a healthy diet, vegetables, vegan, meat, beans. You just have to get food that works for you. Deep Nutrition, Dark Calories by Catherine Shanahan. Catherine Shanahan argues that seed oils, what's called vegetable oils, she says that's the main problem because it's damaging our mitochondria, causing inflammation and insulin resistance. Casey Means and Callie Means with their book Good Energy, also valuable, recent, and influential in the new administration. So this has a long history. And in this article, The Progressive Era Body Project, the author looks at the work, the early progressive era, which is where sort of the federal dietary guidelines have their early origin with dietitians and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But the view was we could change our bodies and our lives by changing our diet. So Lulu Hunt Peters, in her Diet and Health, The Key to the Calories, she said, if you want to watch your weight and be slender, you need to count calories. And so this article is about how that worked. And it didn't work, again, for most people. They counted calories, they lost weight for a while, and then they had enormous cravings and they blamed themselves, they gained weight. And the argument that this has been damaging, these progressive era diet fads have been damaging to Americans for well over a century. The same author wrote this book, Supersizing America, also interesting, noting that after the Watts riots and the inner cities were damaged all over the country, the government wanted to fund minority-owned businesses to replace the ones that were burned down. And the Small Business Administration stepped in and they funded fast food restaurants, franchises in the inner cities, minority owned, but they couldn't finance grocery stores. And the problem was grocery stores had more sales, even though not more profits, more sales, and the sales number was above an arbitrary line that the Small Business Administration had. So grocery stores in the inner city don't get funded, but fast food restaurants do. So for 40 years now, the inner cities have been full of fast food restaurants, minority owned, have developed a whole culture, minority culture around fast food restaurants, and basically unhealthy food. The meat is healthy, the chicken can be healthy, but the seed oil, vegetable oils aren't, the buns aren't, there's sugar everywhere, the sugary drinks aren't. And so minorities are eating far more sugar and carbohydrates than they would have been had their traditional foods been maintained and supported by grocery stores in the inner cities, and it was federal government policy that caused that. So now they talk about food deserts, and it's a problem, but this is interesting, the origins of those problems. So again, back to the history here, the American Dietitians Association, the original founder was a follower of John Harvey Kellogg, who was a Seventh-day Adventist, and the Kellogg cereal business was all about getting people off meat, getting them eating grains, which they thought were very healthy at the time. And, there's evidence on all sides of this. It's worth comparing the epidemiological evidence, the studies by the Seventh-day Adventists, the Blue Zone studies funded by the Seventh-day Adventists and National Geographic claim to show that, places where they eat mostly plants, people live longer. But there's problems with those claims, and you can look that up on your own. Again, it's sort of a blending of religion, science, philosophy, and politics to establish a scientific rationale for vegetarianism. And we've got much the same today, saying, sort of animal rights and save the planet by reducing, cattle belching and flatulence. And therefore it's, save the earth by eating less animal meat. But the byproduct of this is people not getting nutrient-dense foods and adding to our metabolic health epidemic. Related to this, plants were healthier 100 years ago. This study, a presentation by Grant Schofield, cites this study saying, look, the average mineral content of calcium, magnesium, iron in cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, and spinach has dropped 80-90% in the last century. Why? Well, it turns out our crop yields have gone way up with increased fertilizers and pesticides, but that's the calorie content. The yield of corn and wheat and soy has gone up, but the nutrients in the soil hasn't gone up, so they're sort of stretched. Like, Bilbo Baggins living to be 120 in Lord of the Rings, he's still alive, but he just doesn't, he feels stretched. So our foods have stretched for nutrients because we've changed the fertility of the soil. The nutrient density of soil has dropped because instead of relying on the rhizome, the microbes to supply the magnesium, iron, and so forth, we're trying to put artificial fertilizers, potassium, pesticides in. So he discusses that. And we don't study magnesium enough because it's hard to measure. Turns out most Americans are magnesium deficient. Now, how did we get this way? This is maybe a side issue from direct nutrition, but these authors I highly recommend, David Montgomery and his wife, Ann Bickel, in their book, The Hidden Half of Nature, related to growing a revolution and what your food ate. They're saying what we see is people, animals, and plants, and we think that is the whole system for food, but half of everything is underground. Its roots and the rhizome, the microbes and all the other invisible things that are underground that are communicating, providing nutrition, protecting the plants. And, when a cow eats grass, that's damage to the grass. It signals the grass to have its roots extrude, push out carbohydrates into the soil. And those carbohydrates feed the rhizome, the microbes. The microbes go out and get the magnesium, calcium, and other minerals that the root needs in order to grow. So it's sunlight, it's water, it's nutrients from the soil. But if you go 80 years, 100 years with harvest after harvest, where you're tilling the soil, you're breaking up the rhizome, you're trying to replace root nutrients with artificial nutrients, fertilizer, and pesticide, you get food that has more calories but less essential nutrients people need. So these people argue regenerative agriculture is now profitable because farmers use less fertilizer, less pesticides, because their soil is healthy, their plants are healthy. The animals who eat those plants are healthier because the plants have more density. So their books, to me, are fascinating, telling the story. Decades ago, I thought this was just hippie stuff, avoiding fertilizer and pesticides, but it turns out it's profitable for more and more farmers across the U.S., and it's the federal farm programs that make this more difficult because they're pouring their money into the giant corporate, corn, wheat, soy. Now, related to the regenerative agriculture is regenerative ranching. You can look at Carbon Cowboys on Facebook or on the internet, and these are ranchers who are changing the way they raise cattle to mimic the buffalo, having more dense, more cattle, way more cattle, and moving them more regularly. This allows the the plants to recover more quickly, the roots to go more dense. And it's amazing the sort of different things that are discussed in this. And of course, they call it soil carbon cowboys because all this carbohydrates pushed into the soil is carbon sequestration, is pulling tons and tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So you can read more about that online. I just think it's fascinating. My writing, in addition to the Goodman study on did the government make us fat, I have a more recent one on seed oils, the debate over seed oils or vegetable oils, citing arguments there, and you can read that online and on normal nutrition. Also, in my flyers and discussions with students on this topic, I look at the different companies who are booming, offering metabolic health services. So as I say, I hope to be on the Low Carb MD podcast, interviewed not too long ago. I was on an earlier version of Life's Best Medicine. Brian Lenskis has an office in Arizona and in San Diego, and he's offering metabolic health services to individuals and companies, as is Toward Health, which is the rebranded name of Dr. Tro Kalayjian. And so you can look at their company and their services. And then Levels is another company offering metabolic health services. Ona Health is doing this. I'll talk about this in a later slide. And then Verta Health, I think, is the largest, offering their metabolic health services. You can look at their moonshots, Verta Health, and you can see their presentation of these ideas. Metabolic Mind is offering educational services. We have an epidemic of mental illness, depression, anxiety. When I proposed changing the dietary guideline as a public school national debate topic, I got a lot of pushback from young coaches who said, I can't give this topic to my students because they have eating disorders, they have body image problems. We can't have them debate about food. But I would argue it's the food they're eating that are causing these problems. Now, what's the percentage? 1/3, 1/4 of young Americans are on ADHD drugs of one kind or another. What if their problems are caused by the food they're eating? As well, it may be lack of sleep or too much screen time on their phones or stress. But the food they're eating, they get a huge percentage of their calories from packaged foods that have these seed oils and high carbohydrates. So let's look at fueling mental health with improving our metabolic health. The Bazuki family has promoted this, and you can get plenty of resources on their website. More about this, they're funding research on this. Ian Campbell, his research on this. And what you're finding is a number of doctors who are overweight, psychiatrists who are overweight, they go on a they go on a ketogenic diet, healthy fat, reduced carbs, to lose weight just because they're overweight, and they find their bipolar disorder and other mental conditions resolve on their own as they burn ketones for fuel for their brain instead of glucose. For a lot of people who have cerebral insulin resistance, this is a game changer for them. This is the Bazuki son, went through this firsthand. He was struggling with mental illness until he, met Dr. Brian Campbell, Dr. Brian, in his book Brain Energy, and improved his metabolic health. So books on this, Dark Calories, Good Energy, I discussed these, and Robert F. Kennedy, Frying a Turkey on Thanksgiving, Make frying oil tallow again, use tallow, beef tallow, just like McDonald's used to use before they were pressured to switch to seed oils. And then there was pushback from the Atlantic and the New York Times saying, look, tallow is bad, it's got saturated fat. It's the same story, saturated fat is bad. So Catherine Shanahan saying seed oils are the problem. Other doctors, Sarah Ballantyne in her book Nutrivore, say, look, we need food that's nutritious. And she says vegetable oil, seed oils are actually healthy. People eat them, they live longer. So it's worth researching on your own. But this is what I think is fabulous for students to research on this topic and at least focus on metabolic health as the standard of care that the federal government should propose to their doctors and medical establishments. Okay, thank you very much for listening.